Since you won the lottery, we need to talk about responsibility. That was the first sentence my mother said when everyone sat down at the dining table that night. And the way she said the word responsibility made it sound less like congratulations and more like a debt I didn't remember owing. 3 days earlier, I had been standing in line at a small convenience store just outside Columbus, Ohio, holding a cup of gas station coffee and a quick pick ticket I almost forgot to check. The screen behind the counter showed the numbers one by one, and when the last number appeared, the clerk looked at me like I had suddenly become someone else. $8.4 million. I remember the humming sound of the refrigerator behind the counter, the smell of burnt coffee, and the strange quiet that followed when the reality finally settled in. The first mistake I made that day was calling my family. At the time it felt natural. I was 67 years old, recently retired from a public library job I'd held for nearly 3 decades, and family had always been the center of my life. I thought they would be happy for me. I thought they would laugh, maybe even tease me about finally taking that road trip across the country I used to talk about. Instead, the next morning my son Daniel sent a message that said only 3 words, "Family meeting tomorrow." When I arrived at my parents' house that evening, the dining room looked exactly the way it had when I was a little girl. Same polished oak table, same china cabinet filled with dishes that were only used on holidays, same yellow kitchen light that made everything look warmer than it really was. My mother Linda had cooked a full dinner, roast chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, and the apple pie she always made when she wanted the evening to feel important. My daughter-in-law Melissa was already seated, her phone placed neatly beside her plate like she was waiting for a business call rather than a family conversation. Daniel gave me a quick hug, the kind that ends before it really begins. My father Robert sat quietly at the end of the table, swirling a glass of iced tea while watching everyone else. For a few minutes the conversation sounded almost normal. They asked about the drive, about the weather, about whether the lottery office had called me yet. But beneath every question, I felt something else moving through the room, something careful and calculating. Melissa was the first to steer the conversation away from small talk. Spoke calmly, almost politely, the way someone explains a well-thought-out plan. "We just wanted to help you think through priorities," she said. Family priorities would benefit everyone long-term. The total near the bottom quietly passed $1 million, and they had only been talking for 10 minutes. Melissa folded her hands neatly in front of her and watched my reaction with a calm expression that reminded me of a bank manager explaining loan terms. "Of course none of this is pressure," she said carefully. "We just want to make sure the money is used wisely." My mother nodded again, her voice soft but certain. "Families support each other. That is how it has always worked." I looked down the table toward my father again. He had barely spoken since dinner began. His plate was still half full, though the food had gone cold. He held his glass of iced tea and slowly turned it in small circles, watching the melting ice move against the glass. The room felt smaller than it had an hour earlier, like the walls had quietly moved closer to the table. Daniel leaned forward again, clearly encouraged by the silence. "And this is only the beginning," he said. "Once we know what the taxes will be, we can really plan things properly." The word plan echoed strangely in my mind. When I bought that lottery ticket at the convenience store, the only plan I had imagined was something simple. Maybe visiting the national parks I had read about for years. Maybe buying a small house closer to the lake where the mornings were quiet and the air smelled like pine trees. Nothing extravagant, just peaceful. But listening to them now, it sounded as if the money had already been divided long before I ever sat down at this table. Melissa flipped the page to reveal another list. "There is also Sophie's future to consider," she said. "College costs keep rising every year." She said it like a gentle reminder, as though I might forget my own granddaughter's education if she did not mention it. My mother added quietly, "It would be wonderful to know that everyone is secure." I realized then that the conversation had slowly changed shape. At first they spoke about helping me manage the winnings. Now they were talking about distributing them. Daniel tapped the paper again with the tip of his finger. "We just want to do this responsibly," he said. My father suddenly set his glass down on the table with a soft clink. It was the first real sound he had made all evening. Everyone looked toward him. For a moment it seemed like he might finally speak, like he might say something to slow the conversation down. Instead he stood up slowly from his chair. His movements were calm, almost tired. He picked up his napkin and placed it carefully beside his plate. Then he looked toward the kitchen where the apple pie was still waiting on the counter. Dessert will have to wait, he said quietly. His voice was not angry. It was not loud, but there was something final in the way he said it. He turned toward the hallway and began walking away from the dining room without another word. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving the rest of us sitting at the table with the list of numbers and a pie that no one seemed interested in anymore. I remained seated for a few seconds after my father left the room, listening to the quiet sound of the hallway floorboards settle after his footsteps disappeared. No one moved at the table. Melissa glanced briefly toward the hallway and then back to the paper in front of me, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a short pause in a meeting. Daniel cleared his throat again and shifted in his chair. He probably just needs some air, he said, though the way he said it sounded more like an excuse than an explanation. My mother reached for her water glass and took a small sip before speaking again, her voice calm and steady. Your father has never liked discussing finances at the dinner table, she said. But that does not mean the conversation should stop. She looked at me with that same patient expression she used when I was a child learning to balance a checkbook for the first time. We are only trying to help you make responsible decisions. I looked down at the paper again. The numbers had not changed while my father walked away. They sat there quietly, waiting for my approval. Daniel leaned forward once more, encouraged by my silence. You do not have to decide everything tonight, he said. But it would help if we knew roughly what direction you are thinking. Melissa added gently, we just want to avoid mistakes that many lottery winners make. I noticed how easily the conversation kept returning to the same idea, as if they were guiding it along a path that had already been mapped out earlier that day. I folded my hands together and rested them on the table, trying to slow my thoughts. The kitchen light reflected off the polished surface of the wood, creating a soft glow that reminded me of hundreds of family dinners in this same room. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday afternoons when laughter came easily and no one brought folders filled with financial projections. My mother broke the silence again. You know we only want what is best for the family, she said. The word family hung in the air like a quiet expectation. I realized then that the paper on the table was not simply a suggestion. It was a test. Daniel pushed the list slightly closer to me. If you could just tell us what feels comfortable, he said. Melissa nodded encouragingly beside him. For a moment I considered answering right away, saying something polite that would keep the evening peaceful. But the image of my father standing up from the table stayed in my mind. The way he had placed his napkin down. The way he had looked toward the pie and then toward the hallway before leaving. It had not felt like someone stepping outside for fresh air. It had felt like someone quietly stepping out of a conversation he did not believe in. I picked up the sheet of paper and studied it carefully for the first time. The numbers were written neatly, organized into categories that made everything appear reasonable at a glance. Mortgage, renovations, investment accounts, future education. Each line sounded responsible on its own. Together they formed something else entirely. I set the paper back down and looked at Daniel, then at Melissa, and finally at my mother. You all spent a lot of time preparing this, I said calmly. Daniel smiled slightly, relieved to hear my voice again. We just wanted to be ready, he said. My mother nodded approvingly. But somewhere down the hallway, I heard a quiet door close, and the sound reminded me that the only person who had not asked me for anything that night was the one who had just walked away. I left the paper exactly where it was on the table and leaned back in my chair for a moment, studying the three faces looking back at me. Daniel appeared hopeful in the way people do when they think an agreement is only seconds away. Melissa maintained the same polite smile, patient and professional, as though this dinner had always been intended to end with signatures and numbers. My mother sat quietly beside them, her hands folded together, watching me carefully the way she used to watch me before I made an important decision as a teenager. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon from the pie cooling in the kitchen, but the warmth that used to belong to this house felt strangely distant now. I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip, giving myself a moment to think. $8.4 million. It still felt like a number that belonged to someone else, not to a woman who had spent 30 years helping people find books in a quiet public library. Daniel broke the silence first. We do not want you to feel pressured, he said quickly, although his voice carried the quiet urgency of someone waiting for a specific answer. Melissa nodded beside him. This is just about protecting your future and the family's stability. My mother added softly, Money changes relationships if it is not handled carefully. That sentence lingered in the air longer than the others. I looked down again at the list, then back at them. You all worked on this today? I asked calmly. Daniel hesitated only a moment before answering. Yes, we thought it would help you. Melissa added. It seemed responsible to prepare. Responsible. The same word my mother had used earlier. I noticed then that none of them seemed surprised by the size of the numbers written on that page. They had already grown comfortable with them. I folded my hands again and asked quietly, did anyone ask what I was planning to do? The question seemed to catch them off guard for a brief second. Daniel blinked and leaned back slightly. Well, that is what we are discussing now, he said. Melissa gave a small, reassuring smile. Of course your goals matter. But large amounts of money should benefit the entire family. My mother nodded once more, as if confirming a simple truth everyone already understood. I let a small silence settle over the table again. Somewhere down the hallway a floorboard creaked faintly, reminding me that my father was still in the house even if he had removed himself from the conversation. I thought about all the years he had worked at the machine shop on the edge of town, leaving before sunrise and coming home with the smell of metal and oil still on his clothes. He had never once asked me for anything beyond a phone call on Sundays. Daniel shifted again in his chair. So what do you think? He asked carefully. The paper sat between us like a contract waiting to be signed. I glanced toward the kitchen where the pie remained untouched. The evening had started with a celebration in mind. Now it felt more like a negotiation. I looked back at them and spoke slowly, choosing each word carefully. I think it is interesting, I said, that everyone here already knows exactly how my money should be used. Daniel's smile faded just slightly, and Melissa straightened in her chair as though sensing the conversation had moved somewhere unexpected. My mother watched me closely, her expression unreadable. The quiet stretched across the table again, longer this time, and for the first moment since the meeting began, I realized something important. The only person who had left the room tonight had also been the only person who had not asked for a single dollar. Daniel looked at me as though he was waiting for the final piece of a puzzle to fall into place, but instead the silence stretched across the table again. Melissa shifted slightly in her chair and adjusted the edge of the folder in front of her, keeping her smile polite but noticeably tighter than before. My mother watched both of them carefully before turning her attention back to me. The same patient look still on her face. No one is asking you to decide tonight, she said softly, though the tone suggested that a decision was still expected sooner rather than later. I nodded slowly and rested my hands on the table. I understand, I replied, and I appreciate that you all spent time thinking about it. Daniel relaxed a little when he heard that. He leaned forward again, encouraged. We just want to make sure everything is handled the right way, he said. A lot of people who win the lottery lose it within a few years. Melissa added gently. With careful planning, you can avoid that. I glanced at the paper again, then back at them. Careful planning, I repeated quietly. The words sounded different when I said them out loud. I stood up slowly from my chair, pushing it back just enough to stand without making a sound against the floor. For a moment, all three of them looked surprised. Daniel blinked and asked, "Where are you going?" I looked toward the kitchen where the pie still waited on the counter beneath the warm light above the stove. Your father mentioned dessert, I said calmly. It would be a shame to let it go to waste. My mother looked briefly uncertain, as if she had not expected the conversation to pause for something so ordinary. Melissa exchanged a quick glance with Daniel, both of them clearly unsure whether this was a break or a delay. I walked into the kitchen and picked up the pie server from the drawer beside the stove. The apple pie smelled exactly the way it always had when I was younger, cinnamon and sugar and warm apples baked into a crust my mother had perfected over 40 years. For a moment, the familiar smell softened the tension in my chest. I cut 4 slices and placed them carefully onto small plates before carrying them back to the dining room. The table looked almost unchanged from when I left it, except the folder now sat closed and Daniel's fingers tapped quietly against the wood. I placed the plates in front of them one by one. Melissa thanked me politely. Daniel nodded. My mother looked down at the slice of pie as if she had forgotten it was there. I sat back down in my chair and picked up my fork. The room remained quiet except for the soft clink of silverware against plates. After a few bites, Daniel finally spoke again. So, he said cautiously, have you thought about what direction you want to go? I finished chewing slowly before answering. Yes, I said. I have thought about it. Melissa straightened slightly in her chair. My mother folded her hands again. Daniel leaned forward with quiet anticipation. I set my fork down beside the plate and looked at each of them in turn. But before we talk about money, I said calmly, there is something I want to understand first. The three of them waited. I glanced toward the hallway where my father had disappeared earlier that evening. When exactly did this meeting get planned? I asked. Daniel hesitated for the first time all night. And in that small pause, I began to suspect that the conversation around this table had started long before I ever walked through the door. Daniel did not answer my question right away. His fork hovered halfway between the plate and his mouth before he slowly set it back down beside the slice of pie. Melissa glanced toward him, then toward my mother, as if silently deciding who should respond first. The hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough to confirm the feeling that had been growing in the back of my mind since the conversation began. My mother finally cleared her throat softly. We talked earlier today, she said. Her voice sounded calm, but there was a careful edge to it now, the kind people use when they realize a simple explanation may not satisfy the person asking the question. I nodded slowly and looked down at my plate for a moment before raising my eyes again. Earlier today, I repeated. Daniel shifted in his chair. It was not a big discussion, he said quickly. Just a quick conversation about how to help you manage things. Melissa added with a polite smile. We wanted to make sure we approached it responsibly. I let their words settle for a moment. The apple pie tasted exactly the same as it always had, warm and sweet with just enough cinnamon to linger at the back of my throat. Yet the room felt colder now, as if the meaning of the evening had quietly changed shape. I set my fork down again and folded my hands. So the plan was already written before I arrived, I said calmly. Daniel hesitated again before nodding. We thought it would make the conversation easier. My mother leaned slightly forward. We only wanted to avoid confusion. Melissa nodded in agreement. It is easier when everyone understands the expectations. Expectations. The word hung in the air for a moment. I leaned back in my chair and studied the three of them again. For the first time that evening, I noticed how comfortable they looked sitting together on the same side of the table, their chairs angled slightly toward each other, as if they had already rehearsed this arrangement earlier in the day. It was not anger that I felt in that moment. It was something quieter, something closer to clarity. Daniel tapped the edge of the paper again, though less confidently than before. You have to understand, he said. This is a life-changing amount of money. Melissa added gently. Families often struggle when money enters the picture. My mother looked at me steadily. We are trying to prevent that. I glanced once more toward the hallway where my father had walked away earlier. The house remained quiet, but I could almost imagine him sitting somewhere down the corridor, perhaps in the small den where he used to read the newspaper every evening. He had left the table the moment the conversation turned into numbers. That detail now felt more important than anything written on the paper. I looked back at the three of them and spoke carefully. It is interesting, I said slowly, that everyone seems to know what should happen next. Daniel frowned slightly. Melissa sat straighter in her chair. My mother remained very still. I reached forward and gently pushed the paper back toward the center of the table. But the strange thing, I continued, is that no one has asked the simplest question. They waited silently. I let the pause stretch just long enough for the quiet clock above the stove to tick once more. Then I looked directly at Daniel. Did it ever occur to anyone here, I asked calmly, that I might already have a plan of my own? The question stayed in the air longer than I expected. Daniel blinked once, then leaned back slightly as if he needed a moment to reconsider the direction of the conversation. Melissa folded her hands on the table again, her polite smile fading into something more careful. My mother remained very still, watching me with the quiet attention she used when she suspected something important was about to be said. For several seconds no one spoke. The ticking clock above the stove filled the silence. Finally Daniel cleared his throat. Of course you can have a plan, he said, though the confidence in his voice sounded thinner than before. We just thought it would make sense to talk through it together. Melissa nodded quickly. That is what families do. My mother added softly. It is better when everyone understands what is coming. I looked at each of them in turn, letting their words settle before answering. The interesting thing about plans, I said calmly, is that they usually belong to the person making them. Daniel shifted in his chair again, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table. We are only trying to help, he said. $8.4 million is not something a person should handle alone. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. You might be right, I said. But the conversation tonight seems to assume that the money already belongs to everyone in this room. Melissa opened her mouth slightly, then closed it again as if reconsidering her response. My mother leaned forward just a little. No one said that, she replied. We are simply talking about responsibility. The word appeared again, exactly where it had started the evening. I rested my elbows lightly on the table and looked down at the paper between us. The numbers were still there, neat and organized, waiting patiently for approval that had not arrived. I slid the paper gently toward Daniel. You prepared this carefully, I said. I can see that. Daniel nodded cautiously. We thought it would help guide the discussion. I glanced toward Melissa. And you helped write it? She nodded once. We both did. My mother said nothing this time, but her expression suggested she had already read every line earlier that afternoon. I leaned back in my chair and allowed a small pause to settle over the table again. The pie plates were nearly empty now. The warmth of the kitchen lights reflected softly off the polished wood surface, the same way it had during hundreds of ordinary family dinners before this one. Yet something about the room felt different now. Clearer. Simpler. You know, I said slowly, I spent most of my life earning modest paychecks. Daniel looked uncertain where this was going, but he listened. 30 years working at the library, I continued. Helping people find books, helping children learn to read, helping students finish research papers. Melissa nodded politely, though she still seemed unsure what point I was making. That work did not make me rich, I said, but it did teach me something useful. Daniel frowned slightly. What is that? He asked. I met his eyes calmly. How to read carefully, I said. Then I tapped the paper once with my finger. And when I read this list tonight, something very important stood out. They waited. Even my mother leaned forward slightly now. I folded my hands again and spoke with quiet clarity. Every single line on this page explains what all of you would like me to do with the money. I paused just long enough for the meaning to settle across the table. But not one line explains why anyone here believes they are entitled to it. The room went completely quiet after I finished speaking. Daniel looked down at the paper as if he were seeing it for the first time, his fingers resting on the edge of the page without moving it. Melissa sat very still beside him, her polite smile gone now, replaced with a careful expression that suggested she was choosing her next words with great precision. My mother remained calm, but her eyes narrowed slightly the way they did whenever she believed a conversation was beginning to drift away from her expectations. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then Daniel leaned forward again, his voice quieter than before. No one is saying we are entitled to anything, he said. We are just talking about what would make sense. Melissa nodded slowly beside him. Families share opportunities, she added gently. When something good happens to one person, it usually benefits everyone. I listened without interrupting, letting their words fill the space between us. The clock above the stove ticked again, steady and indifferent. My mother folded her hands neatly together and spoke in a calm, almost patient tone. You have always been generous, she said. No one here doubts that. I noticed how carefully she chose those words. Generous. Not obligated. Not required. Just generous. Daniel picked up the paper again and turned it slightly toward me, though he did not slide it across the table this time. We are simply discussing possibilities, he said. Nothing here is a demand. I nodded slowly. That is good to hear, I replied. Melissa leaned forward slightly, her voice soft. You know we all care about you. The statement hung in the air for a moment. I looked at the three of them sitting together across the table, their chairs angled toward each other like a quiet alliance. Then I glanced once more toward the hallway where my father had disappeared earlier that evening. The house remained silent. In that direction, but the memory of his quiet departure stayed clear in my mind. He had not argued. He had not explained. He had simply stood up and walked away before dessert. I returned my attention to the table and rested my hands on the wood surface. I believe you when you say this is not a demand, I said calmly. But the way the evening has unfolded makes it feel very close to one. Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, but paused when he saw I was not finished speaking. You all prepared this list before I arrived, I continued. You discussed numbers before asking what I wanted to do. And the conversation tonight has focused entirely on how the money could be distributed. Melissa sat straighter now, her voice slightly firmer. We are only trying to think ahead. My mother nodded in agreement. Planning is not the same as taking. I considered that for a moment. Then I gently pushed the paper back across the table again until it stopped in front of Daniel. You are right, I said quietly. Planning is not the same as taking. Daniel looked relieved for a moment, but that expression faded quickly when I added the next sentence. But planning for someone else's money without asking them first is still a very interesting way to begin a family celebration. The quiet returned once again. Even the clock seemed louder now. Daniel looked down at the paper. Melissa looked toward my mother, and my mother finally leaned back in her chair with a long, measured breath. For the first time that evening, the certainty in the room had begun to crack, and everyone at the table seemed to realize that the conversation was no longer following the plan they had written earlier that day. My mother was the first to speak again after the silence settled across the table. She leaned back slowly in her chair and folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm, but noticeably firmer than before. This evening was meant to be a discussion, she said, not a confrontation. Daniel nodded quickly beside her, grateful for the shift in tone. Exactly, he added. We are all on the same side here. Melissa gave a small agreeing smile and glanced down at the paper again, though she did not touch it this time. I listened carefully to their words. The room felt different now, as though the certainty that had filled it earlier had thinned into something more cautious. I rested my hands lightly on the table and allowed the quiet to linger for a moment before answering. I am not trying to confront anyone, I said calmly. I am only trying to understand how this evening turned into a financial planning session before I even finished my first slice of pie. Daniel exhaled softly and rubbed the back of his neck. You are taking it the wrong way, he said. We just thought it would be responsible to talk about it early. Melissa nodded. It is better to organize things before problems appear. My mother added gently. Money has a way of complicating families if people are not careful. I looked at her thoughtfully. That is true, I said. But it can also reveal things very clearly. No one answered right away. The clock above the stove ticked again, marking the passing seconds in the quiet kitchen. I glanced toward the hallway once more. The door at the end remained closed, and I imagined my father sitting somewhere inside the small den where he often read after dinner. His absence from the table felt more significant with each passing minute. I returned my attention to the others and spoke carefully. When I bought that lottery ticket, I said, I did not imagine it would lead to a meeting like this. Daniel sighed quietly. It is not about the ticket, he replied. It is about the responsibility that comes with it. I nodded once. Yes, responsibility. The word sounded familiar now, repeated enough times that it had begun to lose its original meaning. Melissa leaned forward slightly. You have always cared about this family, she said. No one doubts that. My mother gave a small approving nod. Daniel watched me carefully, waiting for my response. I let another brief silence pass before speaking again. You are all right about one thing, I said. Winning the lottery does change things. Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly, as though he believed the conversation might finally be moving back toward the plan they had written earlier. Melissa's polite smile returned, though more cautiously this time. My mother waited quietly. I looked down at the paper one last time, then back at them. It changes how people see each other, I continued. Calmly. Before this week, none of us would have spent an evening calculating how to divide money that does not belong to us. Daniel frowned slightly. Melissa looked uncertain. My mother remained still, watching me closely. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands together again. The strange part, I said slowly, is that the only person who did not seem interested in that calculation is the one who left the table before dessert. The room fell silent once more. Daniel glanced toward the hallway without speaking. Melissa looked down at her plate. My mother breathed in slowly and then out again. And in that quiet moment, it became clear that the conversation they had planned earlier that day had already begun to unravel. No one spoke for several seconds after I mentioned my father. The quiet felt heavier now, like the room itself was waiting for someone to acknowledge the obvious. Daniel finally shifted in his chair and glanced toward the hallway again before looking back at me. Dad has always been like that, he said with a small shrug. He does not like talking about money. Melissa nodded quickly as if that explanation settled the matter. Some people just prefer to avoid financial conversations, she added. My mother did not respond immediately. She sat very still, her fingers folded together in her lap, watching me with the same careful attention she had shown all evening. I noticed something in her expression then, something that looked less certain than before. I leaned back slightly in my chair and let the silence linger again before speaking. It was not the conversation he avoided, I said calmly. It was the direction of it. Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean? I glanced once more at the paper still resting near the center of the table. He left at the exact moment the discussion stopped being about congratulations and started being about percentages. Melissa opened her mouth as if to respond, then paused. My mother's gaze dropped briefly toward the paper as well. Daniel shook his head lightly. You are reading too much into it, he said. He probably just felt uncomfortable. I nodded once. That is possible, I replied. But I have known him for 67 years. I let that sentence rest quietly between us. Melissa shifted in her chair, her earlier confidence replaced with a careful stillness. My mother slowly reached for her water glass and took a small sip before setting it back down. Your father has always believed that people should make their own choices, she said at last. Her tone was softer now. Daniel glanced at her in surprise, but she did not look at him. I rested my hands on the table again and spoke gently. And that might be the most important thing anyone has said tonight. Daniel leaned forward again, his patience beginning to thin. No one is trying to take away your choices, he said. We just thought we could help guide them. Melissa added quietly. We were thinking about the long term. I nodded thoughtfully. I understand that. I looked down at the paper once more, then slowly folded it in half and placed it beside my plate. Daniel watched the movement carefully. What are you doing? He asked. Putting the discussion into perspective, I replied. Melissa looked uncertain. My mother remained silent, her eyes following the folded sheet of paper. I leaned back again and allowed my voice to remain calm and steady. You see, something became very clear to me tonight. Daniel crossed his arms slightly. And what is that? He asked. I met his eyes without raising my voice. This money may have arrived suddenly, I said. But the way people react to it reveals things that have been quietly building for years. The clock ticked again above the stove. Melissa looked down at the table. Daniel said nothing. My mother sat back slowly in her chair, her expression thoughtful. I glanced once more toward the hallway where my father had disappeared earlier that evening. And the person who understood that first, I added quietly, was the one who decided not to stay for dessert. My mother remained quiet for a long moment after my last sentence. Her eyes rested on the folded sheet of paper beside my plate, and the room seemed to settle into a silence that felt heavier than any argument could have been. Daniel shifted in his chair again, clearly uncomfortable with how far the conversation had drifted from the plan he and Melissa had prepared earlier that day. Melissa straightened slightly and brushed an invisible crumb from the table as though small movements could restore some order to the evening. The kitchen light continued to glow softly above us, reflecting off the polished wood surface that had witnessed decades of family dinners that were far simpler than this one. Daniel finally exhaled and leaned forward again, his voice careful. So what are you saying exactly? He asked. I looked at him calmly. I am saying that tonight has already answered a question I did not know I had, I replied. Melissa glanced toward my mother, waiting for her to speak, but my mother remained silent. Daniel frowned slightly. What question? He asked. I rested my hands on the table and spoke slowly. The question of what this money really changes. Melissa gave a small, uncertain smile. It gives you security, she said. And opportunities. I nodded gently. Yes, I said. But more than that, it reveals priorities. The words settled quietly between us. Daniel leaned back again, his arms folding loosely across his chest as he tried to read my expression. My mother finally lifted her gaze from the paper and looked at me with a long, thoughtful expression that felt different from the careful certainty she had shown earlier in the evening. And what have you decided? She asked softly. I glanced briefly toward the hallway again, imagining my father sitting in the quiet den where he had gone after leaving the table. Then I returned my attention to the three people still sitting across from me. I have decided something very simple, I said calmly. Daniel straightened in his chair again. Melissa leaned forward slightly. My mother watched me without blinking. I placed my hands together on the table and spoke in the same steady tone I had used all evening. Before any money is discussed again, I said, I will be speaking with a financial advisor and an attorney. Daniel opened his mouth as if to interrupt, but I raised my hand slightly to finish the thought. Not because I do not trust anyone here, I continued, but because $8.4 million deserves careful planning that happens somewhere other than a dinner table. Melissa slowly leaned back in her chair. Daniel glanced down at the folded paper again. My mother breathed in slowly and nodded once, a small motion that seemed to acknowledge the finality of the decision. The conversation had reached a place none of them had expected when they wrote that list earlier that afternoon. I stood up from my chair and carried my empty plate toward the kitchen sink. The sound of the faucet running briefly filled the room. When I returned to the doorway of the dining room, the three of them were still sitting exactly where I had left them, the folded sheet of paper resting quietly between them like a plan that had already lost its purpose. For a few moments no one moved after I returned from the kitchen doorway. Daniel still sat with his hands resting on the table, his eyes fixed on the folded paper as though he was hoping the numbers might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. Melissa sat beside him, her posture straight but noticeably quieter than earlier in the evening. My mother remained calm, though the careful certainty she had carried into the meeting seemed to have softened into something more reflective. The room felt different now, not tense, but quieter in a way that suggested the conversation had already reached its natural ending. I stepped back toward the table and gently picked up the folded sheet of paper. Daniel looked up at me immediately. Melissa followed his movement with her eyes. My mother simply watched. I held the paper for a moment, feeling the weight of something that had seemed so important only an hour earlier. Then I placed it back down in the center of the table. "You should keep this," I said calmly. Daniel frowned slightly. "Why?" he asked. I gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Because it reminds me of something useful," I replied. Melissa tilted her head slightly. "What is that?" she asked. I rested my hands lightly on the back of my chair and answered with the same quiet tone I had used all evening. "That money has a strange way of revealing conversations people were already having when you were not in the room." No one argued with that. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose, as if the evening had suddenly grown longer than he expected. Melissa lowered her gaze to the table. My mother reached forward and gently smoothed the folded paper with her fingertips, though she did not open it again. I glanced toward the hallway one last time, then walked down it quietly. The small den at the end of the hall was dim except for the lamp beside my father's chair. He sat there exactly the way I imagined he would, reading glasses resting low on his nose, a newspaper folded across his lap, even though he was not actually reading it. When he looked up at me, his expression was calm and almost amused. "Meeting finished?" he asked. I nodded once and leaned lightly against the doorway. "Yes," I said. "I think it is." He studied my face for a moment, then gave a small nod of his own. "Good," he said quietly. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. The quiet in that small room felt very different from the silence at the dining table. It felt peaceful. Finally he glanced toward the kitchen and said, "Did anyone eat the pie?" I smiled slightly. "Yes," I answered, "but not the way they expected." My father chuckled softly at that and returned his attention to the newspaper resting on his lap. I stood there for another moment before turning back toward the dining room. The meeting had begun with numbers and expectations, but it ended with something much clearer. $8.4 million could change many things in a person's life. But the most valuable thing it had given me that evening was a simple understanding of who truly belonged at my table.